Okay, folks, wanted to talk a little bit about international trade. We're going to start getting into the macro portion of the class: international trade, international finance, GDP, inflation, unemployment, and then you guys will be ready for the next exam. So why don't we go start off this section on international trade, talking about some things that have happened fairly recently. U.S. tariffs aimed at China and South Korea to hit target markets. So, if you've been following the news, you know that the Trump administration is not too happy about the big trade deficit that the U.S. has been running. It's been running that for a long, long time. It thinks that anytime other countries sell more to us than they buy from us, somehow we're getting ripped off. And so they've announced tariffs on certain products coming from China and South Korea. So there are the Trump administration, this is prior to them imposing even further tariffs on steel and aluminum coming from China and other countries as well. So they want to impose, or back then in January, they wanted to impose tariffs on solar panels made in China and washing machines made in South Korea. But a lot of these things may be assembled, let's say, in China or South Korea, but the parts are made in a lot of other different countries. So it'll actually have a bigger impact on countries outside of South Korea and China. This is another article going back to I think it was around the time of the election. I think in 2012, if I remember correctly, Romney was running against President Obama, and the thing that I found pretty interesting about this article was that he was accusing President Obama of doing or of not doing anything to prevent China from subsidizing their auto parts makers. There's an organization called the WTO, the World Trade Organization. It was actually created by the United States. They set up the rules for world trade that all countries have to live by, including the United States. And one of the things that they made illegal or unkosher is subsidizing your producers. Now, one of the reasons I found this article to be so interesting was because I'm thinking Romney probably owns these factories in China that are making these parts, and he's going after Obama for not doing enough to prevent the Chinese government from subsidizing their auto parts manufacturers. This is another article that talks about something President Obama did after getting elected in 2008. He slapped a tariff. A tariff is a tax on imports on tires coming from China. So the Chinese government said that goes against regulations, WTO regulations, and they're going to take it to the WTO. The WTO actually has a court, and they're judges from different countries that sit on that court. And what they're supposed to do is apply WTO regulations to decide whether or not something is justified or not under the rules of the WTO. So the tariff that was imposed on tires was 4% on all tires and 35 to 55% on the least expensive tires. So a lot of people might ask, well, who would be hurt by it? Who would benefit by it? Well, the obviously the people who would be hurt by it would be anybody buying tires, and people who buy the least expensive tires, probably like lower income people, are going to get hit hardest because it's going to put a much bigger tariff on these cheaper tires. Some people would say, well, who's behind it? I mean, probably the U.S. tire makers. It turns out they weren't. The reason the U.S. tire makers didn't care about tires coming from China is because they own the factories in China that make those tires too. The people who were behind it was the United Steelworkers Union that represents U.S. tire makers here in the United States. Why did it make a difference to them? Well, obviously, if the tires are made in the U.S., that would mean more jobs for U.S. tire workers. If these tires are made in China, then U.S. tire makers wouldn't quite have so many jobs. This is another article that goes way back. It's really relevant today. This goes back to 2005. Japan payback with U.S. steel levy. So let me explain what was going on in the 1980s. This is a long time ago. The big producer of steel, the one that U.S. steel makers were concerned with, was the Japanese. So what happened was in the 1980s, the United States imposed tariffs on Japanese steel because they said that Japanese steel makers were dumping. Dumping goes against the rules of the international trading system. Dumping is when you sell something at less than cost. Well, this case went to the WTO, went back and forth for 20 some odd years. Finally, the WTO ruled that we here in the United States didn't have the right to impose tariffs on Japanese steel. They were not dumping; they were just selling it in the United States at a lower cost than they were selling it in Japan. The reason that Japanese steelmakers were able to sell steel in the U.S. at a lower price compared to Japan was because Japanese steelmakers in Japan had a monopoly, so they could charge people who use steel in Japan more money, but they had to compete in the U.S. steel market. So in order to get in, they had to have a more competitive price. But that's not dumping. Dumping is when you sell at less than cost. So the WTO told the United States you have to pay back those tariffs that you levied on Japanese steel. The problem was it had its effect, meaning that it boxed Japan out of the U.S. steel market for a couple decades, and now we don't worry too much about steel coming from Japan. We worry about it coming from China and some other places. This is another article that talks about a banana dispute. So let me set this up. Banana producers in Central and South America took the European Union to the WTO because the European Union was imposing tariffs on bananas coming from Central and South America because they wanted to favor bananas coming from their former colonies in Africa. This also goes against WTO regulations. The United States came in on the side of the Central and South American banana producers. Now, normally, if I was in class, we'd have a back and forth as to why the U.S. would get involved in a banana dispute. We obviously don't grow bananas here in the United States. And the reason is that even though the bananas are grown in countries like, let's say, Costa Rica or Ecuador, Guatemala, or Peru, or wherever, the companies that grow those bananas there are actually U.S. companies like Chiquita or Dole or Del Monte. So this case went to the WTO. The WTO said to the European Union, you don't have the right to do this. You would think it would have been resolved, that they dropped their tariffs, but it's actually a case that's still ongoing. But I just wanted to point this out. So the WTO is this organization that was set up over decades to go back to arbitrate, so to speak, cases involving international trade. All right. So let's talk about the type of things in broad categories that the United States imports and exports. We export agricultural and forest products, chemical and energy products, textiles, apparel, and footwear, minerals and metals, electronic machinery and transportation, miscellaneous manufactures, and special provisions, whatever they happen to be. What is it that we import? We import agricultural and forest products. Chemicals and energy products, textile, apparel, and footwear, minerals and metals, electronic machinery and transportation, miscellaneous manufacturers, and special provisions. So then some people might say, why do we import the same kind of things that we export? And there's a variety of reasons. Like if you think about, let's say, let's just take food, for example. We grow certain types of crops in the United States, but there are other kinds of crops that we can't grow. So if you want a variety of different kinds of foods, then you have to be willing to import, let's say, bananas or pineapples or things like coffee from other countries that have the kind of climate to grow that thing, those type of crops. Now, on the other hand, we do very well growing crops that grow in a temperate climate, things like wheat and soybeans and corn. We grow so much of it that we're able to export it. So one of the things that trade allows people to do is consume a bigger variety of products. Another thing, like if you think about things like, for instance, I don't know, machinery and transportation. So we make cars here in the United States, but a lot of people may not want a U.S. made car, you know, a car like a GM or a Chrysler or a Ford, and they might want a car that maybe is a little bit more reliable or less costly to operate, maybe like a Japanese car or Korean car, or some people want high performance cars, so they kind of gravitate towards European cars. So those are reasons why we might import some of the very same goods that we export. In terms of who are our largest trading partners, China has become, they recently eclipsed Canada to become our largest trading partners in terms of imports and exports. Now, interestingly, with China, we run a very big trade deficit. Our other trading partners we run deficits with, but they're not quite as big. So, for instance, Canada used to be our largest trading partner. Mexico used to be our second biggest trading partner. But over time, since China joined the WTO in 2000, they've moved up the ranks in terms of trade with us in the United States. And one of the things you'll notice is we tend to have deficits with our top 15 biggest trading partners. Not all of them, but most of them. Another thing you might notice from this is that these 15 countries account for 75% of the volume of world trade. So meaning there's something like 200 countries in the world. Just these 15 countries, though, account for most of the trade that we do here in the United States. And a lot of these countries are countries that are close to us, right? Like Canada and Mexico are not that far. And the kind of trade we do with almost all of these countries involves products that have a lot more value added, like manufactured goods. All right, so what is the basis of trade? The basis of trade is comparative advantage. How is comparative advantage determined? One way is if a country has a lot of natural resources. So, for example, the reason we import so much oil from Saudi Arabia and the Middle East is because they have so much of it in the first place. Another source of comparative advantage would be climate. We were talking a little while ago about trade in agricultural goods. So we've got a temperate climate, which means that that favors our production of things like soybeans and wheat and corn, crops that grow well in a temperate climate. Other countries might have a tropical climate, which would favor, let's say, the production of bananas or pineapples or crops that or sugar that tend to grow better in a tropical climate. Another source of comparative advantage is developing specialized industries. If you shop around nowadays for electronic stuff, you might notice that a lot of the good electronics in the world comes from Korea. So Korea has developed an expertise in making electronic products. Before that, it was Japan, and before that, it was the United States. So what happens is, over time, countries try to move up in terms of value added and develop specialized industries that, let's say, can produce electronics and then maybe automobiles and things of that nature. Another source of comparative advantage is having abundant resources of one kind or another. So, for instance, the reason we buy so many inexpensive things made in China is because a lot of that inexpensive stuff, let's say like textiles or toys, involves labor, and China has a large population. And because they have a large population, they're able to keep their labor costs down. The supply of labor is big relative to the demand. The kind of products that we export, and by the way, the United States is one of the world's largest exporters, involve a lot of capital. So if you think about what we export things like pharmaceuticals, computer software, airplanes, heavy equipment. Those are the kind of things that we specialize in exporting, and those are the kind of things that either need a lot of physical capital to produce or a lot of human capital. Like when you think about a pharmaceutical drug, it takes a lot of people who are PhDs in pharma or biology or chemistry, things of that nature. That's what we mean by human capital. And when we talk about physical capital, if you think about what it takes, let's say, to produce an airplane like a 787 or something like that. That requires a lot of physical capital. And then, of course, other countries have abundant natural resources. So countries that export a good tend to export a good for which they have quite a bit in the way of resources. All right, I'm going to end it here, and I'm going to create another video for you folks after this.